Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Let's Talk About Work on LinkedIn Live. We'll get started in just a minute. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Let's Talk About Work. Thank you so much for joining me once again this Wednesday night. If you don't know already, I'm Natasha Bowman, also known as the Workplace Doctor, and I'm so excited to have you here today. So, without further ado, we're going to get started with tonight's episode. Well, over the years, I have come to be known as the workplace doctor, as I said before, and I have worked with hundreds of organizations to observe their workforce habits, point out dysfunction and prescribe changes that would ease their organizational pain. And what I've discovered time and time again is that what truly plagues these organizations isn't the misconduct of a few bad players, guilty as they may be. No, the problem runs culture deep. And without therapy designed to treat the deep disease, they would continue to suffer the pain of misconduct and its costly legal repercussions. So tonight, we are going to survey the 5 of the most notorious cases of cultural pain that I've discovered in my 2 decades of human resources work. In fact, I'll call them culture vultures. Much like the bird who preys on others' misfortune, the vulture is a person, a system, or a state of affairs that perpetuates itself by preying on the weak and vulnerable. Now, the problem with cultural virtues is that it's more about political correctness or avoiding lawsuits. Vultures destroy workplaces by diminishing otherwise talented individuals. Right. So instead of encouraging an organization to minimize its potential, vultures pick it apart from the inside until there's nothing left. So let's unpack the 5 cultural virtues that are wreaking havoc on your workplace. All right. Who's with me tonight? I'm so glad that you are here. So let's start with our first vulture, which is corporate conformity. All right. Now, cultures that focus on maintaining a very specific image naturally filter out whoever doesn't belong, right? And this does more than create an unsafe space for outsiders. It locks them into disengaged, right? Mediocrity. And that's not what we want in organizations, right? When we think about culture conformity, we think of the fact that we are just, we're coming into the workplace and we don't feel empowered to be our authentic or genuine selves, right? And so, therefore, you go into the culture, and this culture may be a toxic workplace, right? For all that you know, it has things within them that we're going to talk about later that are part of those culture virtue things, but it has these acts and things that people say and that they do that do not create positive and inclusive cultures. And what we tend to do is kind of go along with it, if you will, and conform ourselves, even though we know that's not the right thing to do for both our on psychological safety and for the psychological safety of others. So what are some ways that we tend to conform to corporate culture? One of the ways is that I know people who, may have names that may be hard to pronounce for some. So they end up changing their name altogether just to accommodate the people that they work with. When we do things like that, we are essentially shedding our identity. We are shedding what makes us who we are. We're shedding that unique background and experience that we bring into the workplace. We may shed our accent, right? I remember when I first moved to New York, I was very, very paranoid about my Southern accent because I kept thinking, am I going to be, you know, am I going to be taken, very seriously, things like that. Because I'm a Southerner, and sometimes there's a stereotype that Southerners are not as educated as people from the North. So I would try to do, accent eliminations so that I would fit in with the culture, right? So people would know that I wasn't from around here. I wasn't very successful, and eventually I embraced my accent, but that was a way that I conformed to that, culture. Sometimes cultures, have things, and we're going to talk about this a little later, microaggressions and people making off-color remarks, and we just kind of laugh and go along with it because other people are laughing and going along with it. But essentially, that is impacting, right? It's impacting how we conform to our culture, which essentially impacts how we perform. So we don't want to do that anymore. We want to not require, as organizations and organizational leaders, people to conform to a culture, especially a culture that is not inclusive, and it is, riddled with some of these culture vultures that we're going to be talking about later on as we go through the stream, right? So that's our first one. That's our first culture vulture, is corporate conformity. And what I want you to get out of it is just feel comfortable being your authentic self, right? Now, does that mean that I show up with hair rollers in my hair and pajamas on a Zoom call? No, that's not what I mean by that. What I mean by being your authentic and genuine self is to embrace your natural identity and don't feel the need to hide things about your identity, things that you should be proud of, things that bring unique perspectives to the organization, right? We should be proud of those things. We should be embracing those things. And as organizational leaders and HR experts and D&I experts, we should be inviting that genuine feeling from our people. All right. So, the next one, if I can just go back to my little banners here that we're going to talk about, is imposter syndrome. That's our second culture vulture, which is, very, very similar, coming out of the conversation of culture conformity. Because what happens is a lot of times when we're hired into an organization, especially if we come from an underrepresented group, or a marginalized group that hasn't necessarily been invited into certain professions, into certain brands, et cetera, we walk in thinking, how did I get here? Was I hired just because there was a diversity initiative? Was I hired as a token employee? So therefore, we feel like we don't belong. And perhaps going back to that culture conformity, if I don't feel comfortable being my natural and authentic self and being genuine, right? Then I feel like an imposter. I feel like I have to what we call code switch, meaning again, conforming to that culture and leaving my general self, my genuine self behind. Right. So when we have that imposter syndrome and we feel like we don't belong in an organization, right? And they're not embracing us and our full identity, we're not able to perform to our optimum level. And that's what we want to do. That's what every organization should want from their employees. So, how do we As organizational leaders, how do we help employees to shed imposter syndrome? This is the advice that I like to give in order to do that. Once you hire a candidate, any candidate, right? It's very important that you articulate to them once they're hired why they were hired, right? So you've gone through assuming hundreds, maybe thousands of resumes. You've interviewed, so many candidates. And this particular candidate that you've chosen probably has gone through three, four, sometimes five and six rounds of interviews with other people. So when you're hired, a lot of times you've gone through the interview process, you've spoken to all these people, you've pitched yourself in your resume, and you've let the organization know, what you think, what value you think you can add to the organization. And then you're hired, you get the offer, that's it. You start, you're onboarded, that's it. And nobody ever has a conversation with you to let you know, hey, you were hired because we saw this value that you would add to this organization, right? So, because you brought this particular background, you brought this particular experience, you brought this type of, success and achievement with you, that add value. We think that's going to add value to our organization. And here are some specific things that we're hoping that your experience, your background will help us to be successful and to move us to the next level. Having a conversation such as that, right? Letting the organization know, or letting the candidate rather know what value they're bringing to the organization once you hire them, why you hired them, right? Why you thought they were so unique than the other candidates. That helps people to shed that imposter syndrome because they know why they're there, they know what the expectation is, and they understand that unique value that you're expecting them to bring. So, therefore, once again, I can shed any of that doubt and that fear that I had about myself. I no longer feel like I'm a token or a quote unquote diversity hire, which, by the way, I hate that. We'll talk about that later. And I don't have to conform. I don't feel like I need to conform going back to that first culture vulture, to, the conform to the culture that may not be as inviting as I need it to be, right? And I also say, hey, it gives me the opportunity to say, hey, if you want me to add this value that we spoke about after I've been there for a while, and maybe I've identified some behaviors or things like that I don't feel comfortable with, I can say, hey, if you really want me to add that value that we talked about, then these are some things about your culture that you need to know that may be a barrier for me to be able to succeed. And look, I know that's a brave conversation to have, but a great organization, an organization that you want to work for, they will appreciate that value. They will appreciate that feedback coming from you. And that also shows, right, how vested you are in the organization, that you're not just showing up just to do your job and that's it and leave and go home. You're vested in the success in the organization, so much so that not only are you contributing value, right, but you're also looking beyond the scope and saying, you know what, if I'm being impacted by this behavior or so on and so forth, others may be too. I'm just going to highlight a comment here from my friend Tony Lorraine Johnson. Many people struggle and don't realize that they're actually struggling with imposter syndrome. And that is absolutely correct. I have seen that time and time again. All right. So, with that being said, that's two culture vultures down. Let's move on to our third culture vulture. All right. Which is microaggressive behavior. And that's just what I kind of hinted upon just a few minutes ago, right? If you have heard me in my speaking engagements, I always share the story, or often share the story of the first time that I kind of experienced a microaggressive behavior. And This at this point, I didn't even know what a microaggression was, but when I looked back at it, I was like, "Oh my gosh, that was such a huge microaggression, and it could have had a significant impact on my career trajectory." So, if you haven't heard this story, I'm going to share it. If you've heard it before, be patient with me. But essentially, right, when I think about microaggressions, my personal story is that before I went to law school, I worked at a mid-sized law firm in Montgomery, Alabama. I was only one of two Black females that worked there. And I was inspired to go to law school while I was working there in an HR position. And so I take the LSAT, I get into law school. And on my very last day that I'm working there, one of the attorneys sends out a note saying, "It's my last day. I'm going off to law school and to wish me luck," which a lot of people did. But later in that day, one of my colleagues, who was the only other African American female that worked there, came to my office and said, "Can I share something with you?" In which I said, "Sure." And she goes, um, I went to one of the partners' offices earlier today, and when I walked in, he said, "Good luck in law school." To which she replied, "Oh, you're mistaken. I'm not going to law school. Natasha is." To which he replied, "Oh, so who were you?" So, she had worked there for 5 years. I had worked there for 3 years. And this person, this partner at this firm who had seen both of us on almost a daily basis, did not know us apart simply because we were the only two African American females at the firm out of like 300 people. So looking back at that, right, that was a microaggression, right? You ignoring my identity, you confusing me with the only other Black female in the office was a microaggression, right? Another one that I experienced later in life is, you see, I wear my hair big and curly now. I tried this earlier in my career. And when I walked into work, my manager told me, "Oh, your hair is so big today. You must not have any important meetings." Right. So, what did that signal to me? Well, it signaled to me, don't wear your hair like this because it's not considered professional. Right. I must not have any important meetings. Right. So, both of those experiences, right, had me to question once again, my value, my worth, the first experience. Am I going to be able to contribute to the field, the law field that's already so underrepresented by women and minorities? There were just, again, those microaggressive behaviors that I'm sure we have all experienced, right? If you have an accent, I talked about it earlier, someone may ask you, "Oh, I hear an accent. Where are you from?" You tell them, "Oh, I'm from Texas," or wherever. And they say, "No, where are you really from?" Right? It's insinuating where you couldn't be from America because you have this accent, right? So I've heard so many stories, right, of people, right, in this microaggressive behavior. And over time, as you experience it, right, it impacts your ability to work. It impacts your ability to provide the most value to the organization, right? So to me, that is probably the culture vulture that really just gets me the most, because I've heard so many stories about microaggressions and people that have experienced them on a day-to-day basis, and they're not quite sure how to handle them. My advice is, number one, nip it right in the bud, right there when you hear it, and say, "Hey, pull the person aside." It doesn't have to be a big confrontation, but pull the person aside to say, "Hey, when you keep mistaking me for such and such, that really hurts my feelings," right? It makes me feel like I'm not valuable, like I'm not being seen, I'm not being heard, I'm not an individual. You're stripping me of my identity, right? And that's not the right thing to do, right? Just having those conversations. And more importantly, if we're talking about culture, right, we also want to create cultures of bystander intervention, meaning that if you hear some of these microaggressions or see behaviors that can wreak havoc on organizations, that you feel comfortable intervening. So maybe that person doesn't feel comfortable. Maybe they're new, maybe they're just not, doesn't just don't feel empowered to say something. Maybe you have the privilege where you have established credibility in the organization, et cetera, and you have that privilege to say, "Hey, pull that person aside when you said such and such to such and such," right? And have that same conversation, let them know that's not the way we do things here. And I need for you to pause and think before you speak, right? Because when you're calling this person, right, you're stripping them of their identity. That's not creating an inclusive behavior. And not only is it offensive to them, it's offensive to me, right? So creating that culture of bystander intervention. So when we hear these things, when we see these things, everybody, right? Everybody is accountable and everybody feels empowered to nip them in the bud. All right. So that was our third culture vulture. Let's move on to our fourth culture vulture, which is unconscious bias, right? I know you probably have heard so much about unconscious bias over the past 2 years or so. I can't tell you how many unconscious bias trainings that I've done personally over the past 2 years, but it continues to present itself, and it presents itself in ways that invisible ways that we sometimes don't even catch, right? So one example that I give of how we miss the opportunity to create inclusive cultures based on our unconscious bias is simply by first impressions, right? We all have first impressions. Our brain works a million miles a minute, right? It processes all of this information in a little bitty bit of time. And it tells us, it signals us very, very quickly when we're in a uncomfortable situation or if we feel comfortable and we want it to move quickly, right? Especially if we think we're, in danger. But sometimes our brain gets it wrong based upon how it's been wired. So when we meet people, right? I want to tell me if I encounter a snake or something like that, hey, that's a snake. It can be poisonous. Run. I want to move quickly. But when I encounter people, I don't know if I want it to move that quickly, right? My brain to move. I want my brain to pause and question that first impression, right? So, one of the examples that I give when I'm doing unconscious bias training as it relates to first impressions is how many of you were told when you're going through the interview process for a job to make sure that you have a firm handshake, right? And look the interviewer straight in their eye. That gives you a lot of confidence, right? How many of you have been told that? I'm sure many of you have. I, as an HR leader, would tell people that. Until one day I was hiring for a position on my team. And I was really excited about this person coming in for an interview. And when he came in, I put my hand out to shake his hand. And this is way before COVID. I'm not encouraging anybody to touch anybody right now. But I put my hand out to shake his hand. And he said, "Do you mind if I don't shake your hand?" And I thought, oh, okay. So as he's going through his interview and he's running me through his resume, I'm back of my head, I'm like, why didn't he shake my hand? Like, do I smell? Am I dirty? What is this? And I had pretty much disqualified him and tuned him out because of that. Until he got to a part in his resume where he had a 12-month gap. And in that, he got to the 12-month gap. And he says, the reason that I had to take a year off work was because I suffer from rheumatoid arthritis. And in fact, that's why I couldn't shake your hand. I'm not physically capable of doing that right now. And I thought, oh my goodness, here I am. I've just about disqualified this person for something that not only was he not physically able to do, but something that was completely not related to his ability to do his job. So that really made me question, well, what are some of the other superficial, arbitrary things that I've been, judging candidates and people that's up for promotion on that really have nothing to do with their ability to do their job? Who am I missing out on? Not only did I almost miss out on this person that, by the way, I hired and they were an excellent hire, but I thought about even like the whole strong eye contact. There are people that have autism, and they don't feel comfortable looking people straight in their eye, right? Making that constant eye contact, but make wonderful employees. Sometimes it's from a cultural perspective. So I challenge you as well, because I went through a really, really big exercise of thinking about that. What are some of those arbitrary, superficial things that I have been judging candidates on just based on my bias, those things that have been wired to me that I've accepted to be real over my decades of work and never challenged myself about that, right? So I challenge you to challenge yourself about identifying what are some of the things that you have been accepting as to be true in terms of what makes a good hire, what makes a good person for a promotion, et cetera, that have nothing to do with their ability to do their job. All right. So that's my nuggets on unconscious bias and a couple of ways that that too can be a vulture to your culture. And now for my final vulture culture vulture that we're going to talk about is lack of accountability. All right. I cannot tell you how many times, especially as an HR lead, that I have seen so much inconsistency and disparity in the level of accountability amongst people in organizations, right? I have seen people that are what we would call lower on the hierarchy be sent home, suspended, maybe even terminated because maybe they didn't wear a uniform right or the dress code was wrong, something like that. But people way up the hierarchy are engaging in just bullying behavior, harassing behavior, creating toxic work environments. And because they bring so much what we think this superficial value to the organization by way of maybe they're the rainmaker or they have certain connections or they're bringing in certain clients, they've been able to get away with this behavior. And again, I've got people without that level of influence, but hard, smart workers, but they are nitpicked for every single thing. It's almost like we can't wait to rush them out the door, right? And that has created an unbearable disparity, this lack of accountability for some people, this disparity of accountability. Because what happens is when you have these people of influence, whether they hold that specific title or whatever brings them that significant influence, essentially they play a large role in shaping the culture of the organization, right? People look to them because they're influential. The organization has told us, it signaled us, hey, this person means a lot to us, right? And so it's bringing so much value. So when they're engaging in these types of behaviors and they're just able to get away with it, right? That sets the tone for the entire culture. And when they're able to get away with things and I'm not, or I'm being told that, my expectation is ABC, but yet their expectation is XYZ, right? Then I'm being signaled that I'm not valuable to this organization. And the truth of the matter is, everyone in the organization should be seen as valuable. Everyone should be seen as an asset, right? Another story that I always tell was when I had open heart surgery at 11 years old, right? A couple decades ago, few decades ago, there were certain things that I remembered about that experience. I remembered the housekeeping people who came to my hospital room and kept it clean and sanitized, right? And always stayed back to talk to my mom because She was lonely sitting there hour after hour, day after day. I think about, the person that wheeled me out of the hospital when I was discharged and how he was skipping for joy and so excited that I was finally going home, right? And I always say, I will never ever remember their names, but I won't forget the way they made me feel, right? They brought such significant value. Notice, I didn't mention the surgeon that saved my life, right? I remembered those little things, those people that created the culture of that hospital, that ensured my safety, that ensured that we had a great experience, although we were going through such a traumatic experience. They tried to lighten it up as much as they could. Those are the people that count, and they deserve the same respect, the same civility, right, as everyone else. And when we hold them to a different standard than others, that is not creating a civil, right, workplace, that in respectful workplace, that an inclusive workplace that we all are striving to maintain. So, that, my friends, are the five culture vultures that are wreaking havoc on your organization. So, if you, all of those things, there's so many more things, but those are my top five. If you're not sure if those five culture vultures are impacting your organization, I would love to come in, me and my team, and do what's called an organizational culture assessment, where we identify the blind spots within your organization, give you a heat map to show you what are the areas, where are the leaders, right? This is where your work should be focused on, right? Because a lot of times, as I talked about in my previous episode, we jump into these initiatives as it addresses culture and things like that, but we jump into them blindly and not really identifying what we're trying to solve for, right? So essentially, what with an organizational culture assessment, we can really thread the needle and really understand those opportunities and understand if you have culture vultures and bust them, right? Because we want to identify tactics to get rid of them so everyone can thrive in the workplace. So, thank you so much for joining me in this week's episode of Let's Talk About Work. Next week, we're going to skip. It is a holiday week, and I'm going to take a little time off. So I will see you, I think it's December 1st. And guess what? This year is almost over. I can't believe it. But until then, follow me on LinkedIn. Let's keep this conversation going. All right. And let's continue to talk about work. Have a good night, everyone.